Yeah, I know.
Thank you for joining us for the Tocqueville Lecture Series talk. My name is Aurelian Creyuță, and I'm the director of the Tocqueville program. It's my pleasure to welcome today Professor Stephen Smith. Stephen is an old friend and a distinguished colleague in our subfield of political theory. He's Alfred Coles Professor of Political Science at Yale. He's the author of several books, including Hegel's Critique of Liberalism, 2 books on Spinoza, Reading Leo Strauss, and most recently, Modernity and Its Discontents.
What was his first book? Can you say the title of that?
I think it's better to focus on the last book than the first one. The first one was on Althusser.
Reading Althusser?
Reading Althusser.
It's up your alley, too.
It's up Jeff's alley. I have not read that one. Are you surprised? Stephen is also the co-author of the Cambridge Companion to Isaiah Berlin, and has recently finished a manuscript entitled In Defense of Patriotism, from which this lecture is drawn. Stephen asked us to mention that he's an avid New York Yankees fan, so we can excuse him for that. But I'd like to add one word about one book that I used in my classes, Introduction to Political Theory in particular. Stephen published his lectures at Yale in a book called Political Philosophy, which is, in my view, a successful book and a very good introduction to courses in political theory. And that's something that I found very useful over the years. The format will be as follows. Stephen will speak for about 35-40 minutes, and we'll take questions after that. I'd like to remind the students from 381 to sign. There's a sign-up sheet here to make sure that they get the credit for that. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Stephen Smith.
Thank you so much, Aurelian and Les. It's an honor to be here at the Tocqueville program, and also to see so many old friends here, Michael and Bill and Jeff, and really lovely. Thank you. I'm honored you would, Richard Yellen, I'm really honored you would come. Thank you so much. And students who've taken the time to come also. As Aurelian mentioned, this is drawn from a book that I've been working on. It's not out yet, but it's really finished. Hopefully will be out next year. So you're getting a little taste of some of the things I've been thinking about in the book. I've put a few thoughts together from the book. I'm not sure they hold together totally logically, but it'll at least give you a taste of some of the things I've been thinking about. And you can ask me anything you like about it afterwards. Okay. Patriotism is loyalty. Loyalty, Eric Fenton, who has written one of the better books on the topic, loyalty, he said, is a vexing virtue. It was a subtitle of his book, Loyalty, a vexing virtue. We admire loyalty to family, to friends, to sports teams, even to institutions, up to a point. I'm deeply, as Aurelian mentioned, devoted to the New York Yankees despite their devastating loss in the ALCS last Saturday night. I am loyal to Yale, an institution where I've taught for over 30 years, probably more loyal than it deserves. I'm loyal as a Jew who cares deeply for the land of Israel, warts and all. And I am also, or believe myself to be, a loyal American. Yet loyalty sits uneasily with other virtues that we equally admire. Qualities like fairness, justice, mercy, equality, open-mindedness. There seems to be something primitive, almost atavistic about loyalty. It seems like the mafia code of Omerta. What if my preference for family and friends comes into conflict or forces me to be unfair to others? Does loyalty to my own country require me to adopt a hostile attitude to others? Does it require me to put America first in the jargon of our time? Does loyalty to America require me to overlook the faults of America, resulting in a kind of bad faith? These are just some of the vexing questions I will touch upon. To parody the political philosopher John Rawls, loyalty, I would argue, is the first virtue of social institutions. It is the tie that binds society together, without which much of human association would be impossible. Yet even among the great philosophers, loyalty has never quite received the respect it deserves. It is the Rodney Dangerfield of the virtues, which is a reference I don't expect the younger people to. In part because it raises the most problematic demands. Raise the question of patriotism, at least in educated circles. And the first thing you're likely to hear is Samuel Johnson's famous barb that patriotism is the last refuge of a scoundrel. Or you might even hear E.M. Forster's wish when he said if he had to betray either his country or his friend, he hoped to have the guts to betray his country. For Forster, you know him as the author of Howard's End, a famous English novelist. For Forster and his group, which was later to become the Bloomsbury Circle, the affirmation of personal affections and aesthetic enjoyments necessarily meant the rejection of all claims on behalf of patriotism, love of country, and public service from the list of the virtues. Forster was completely consistent with this perspective when he presented the choice of friendship over country, you might say of private over public goods, as a tragic and even a noble decision. A number of years before Forster had made this comment, 3 young undergraduates, Kim Philby, Donald MacLean, and Guy Burgess, all members of the Cambridge Apostles in the 1930s, chose to betray their country. They became Soviet agents and for years passed on vital secrets to Moscow as they ascended the ladder of the British intelligence services until they were finally exposed in the 1950s and 60s. It was not long after that that the 3, in fact, began to betray one another. To be sure, treason has always had its defenders. To paraphrase what Oscar Wilde once said about war, so long as treason is regarded as wicked, it will always have its fascination. Only when it is regarded as vulgar will it cease to be popular. It was about war, actually, but I'm praising it. In his foreword, actually, to Kim Philby's autobiography, My Silent War, Graham Greene, famous novelist and friend of Philby's, Graham Greene sought to provide a high-minded justification for Philby's betrayal of his country, which over time cost the lives of hundreds of loyal and patriotic Britons. He betrayed his country. Yes, perhaps he did, Greene writes. But who among us has not committed treason to something or someone more important than a country? In Philby's own eyes, this is still Greene speaking, in Philby's own eyes, he was working for a shape of things to come from which his country would benefit. This is an extraordinary piece of sophistry for its combination of moral fastidiousness, the who among us, and a Machiavellian logic that claims in the long run Philby was actually working for the interests of his own country. Greene goes on to compare Philby to an English Catholic living under the reign of Elizabeth I, working for the victory of Spain. How many a kindly Catholic, he writes, must have endured the long and bad days of the Inquisition with this hope of the future as a riding anchor, he asks. Revealingly, Greene's concern is with the kindly Catholic who suffers at a distance from the injustices and cruelty inflicted by his own faith, and not at all with the victims of the Inquisition or Stalin's purges, to whom or for whom he has nothing to say. But if betrayal is a vice, it is by no means clear that patriotism is a virtue. Can we, as Aristotle famously asked, be both good citizens and good human beings? A good citizen is one who serves her country well, who is loyal to the Constitution. A good human being is loyal only to the best regime, to what is truly good, always and everywhere. Citizen virtue requires loyalty to a particular society. Human virtue seems to require a broader loyalty to the good, simply. Patriotism seems a relative virtue, human goodness more universal. Can we be both loyal members of a particular city, nation, or state, and at the same time fulfill our larger moral obligations to humanity? In other words, is philopatria, or love of country, consistent with philoanthropia, or love of fellow human beings? And if patriotism is a virtue, as I contend that it is, it might be useful to ask just what kind of virtue is it? Patriotism must deal with two alternatives from which I want to distinguish it. Here again, as in most things, I want Aristotle to be my guide. In his Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle taught that all virtues, all excellences of heart and mind, are best understood as a mean point, or a mean along a continuum of excess and deficiency. Virtue is always a matter of finding the proper balance between two contending vices. So what then are the extremes to which patriotism is prone? The excess of patriotism is a kind of nationalist zeal that holds absolute attachment to one's own country, one's own way of life, one's country, one's cause, is unconditionally good, if not superior to every other. This is the kind of loyalty expressed in such simple and often brutal sentiments as "my country right or wrong," or that used to be displayed on bumper stickers back in the old days, "my country, love it or leave it." But it is important to recognize that nationalism and patriotism are two quite different things, even though they are frequently confused. It expresses a human need to belong, for reverence, and for a kind of love. An attachment to one's family, language, country, its traditions, and way of life is a natural and very human sentiment. This is entirely different from nationalism, which is a manufactured affect, which emerged only in the late 18th century with the creation of that specifically modern entity called the nation state. Patriotism draws on an entirely different emotional register. Patriotism, French President Emmanuel Macron said on the 100th anniversary of Armistice Day, patriotism is exactly the opposite. Historian should know that. Patriotism and nationalism may grow out of a common root, but they are not. But their branches spread in different directions. But they are not opposite of one another. Nationalism is a language of grievance and resentment. Its stories are ones of inclusion and exclusion, of who is in and who is out. Patriotism is closer to a sense of civic reverence rather than national self-assertion. Patriotism is a form of bonding over a life in common. It implies an acceptance, by no means an uncritical or complacent one, of the form of life into which we have been born. No piece of writing better defines the distinction between the nationalist and the patriot than George Orwell's Notes on Nationalism. Orwell was a peculiar kind of patriot. A former member at least, of the British Imperial Police in Burma, a partisan who fought in the Spanish Civil War, a day laborer in London and Paris. He suddenly discovered at the outset of World War II that he was an English patriot. But what did that mean? In the introduction to his famous collection, The Lion and the Unicorn, written during the Blitz over London, he wrote the following sentence. As I write, highly civilized human beings are flying overhead trying to kill me. For Orwell, patriotism meant, and I quote him here, devotion to a particular place and a particular way of life, which one believes to be the best in the world, but has no wish to force on other people. Nationalism, by contrast, remains inseparable from the desire for power, and especially the desire to acquire more power and prestige for one's nations at the expense of others. It is at bottom, as again I said, an ideology of grievance and resentment. A nationalist, Orwell wrote, is one who thinks solely or mainly in terms of competitive prestige. His thoughts always turn on victories, defeats, triumphs, and humiliations. But patriotism is identified by all lowercase qualities and virtues. It is associated with a love of liberty, where this means the liberty to, and I quote Orwell again, the liberty to have a home of your own, to do what you like in your spare time, to choose your own amusements instead of having them chosen for you from above. And among the qualities admired by Orwell were the gentleness, one can maybe dispute these, the gentleness and essentially privateness of English life, its manners and habits, its indifference to the arts, its pub culture, its bad food, and the quintessential English love of gardening. We are a nation of flower lovers, he says. Recently, Yoram Mazzoni, in his book, The Virtue of Nationalism, has attempted to rehabilitate this term as a legitimate response to the arrogance of post-Cold War liberal hegemonism. The idea of the national state, Mazzoni contends, has biblical roots, going back to the famous Tower of Babel story, but was given legal sanction in the post-Westphalian system of European national states. Mazzoni's brief is a call for national self-determination. Each state should have the exclusive right to determine its own affairs within its own sovereign territory. Mazzoni is rightly disturbed by the relentless and often hypocritical attacks on Israel for its assertion of a strong Zionist identity. But he turns one case into a defense of all nationalisms. We will not be enamored with what every nation does with this freedom, he writes in the conclusion of his book, but in tolerating the way of other nations, we will be released from the old imperialist hatred of the different and the diverse. Unfortunately, this rosy image of nationalism gives at best only half the picture. As Hannah Arendt showed in The Origins of Totalitarianism, since the French Revolution, the rights of man and the rights of citizens have become one and the same. Only membership in a national state can guarantee rights, and people without states find themselves systematically dispossessed. So what then to do with people who don't or simply won't fit into the national idea? The idea that Germany is for Germans, Israel for Jews, America for Americans, seems based on a deliberate exclusion of peoples, often ethnic and religious minorities, who don't match the national stereotype. What is to be done with the stateless, the dispossessed, the migrant, those without passports, who find themselves quarantined in detention camps and refugee camps, often for considerable periods of time, years at a time? A doctrine of strict nationalism renders us mute in the face of these deliberately imposed cruelties. But considerations intended to apply only to foreign peoples will inevitably be used to stigmatize domestic others. It is only a matter of time until a doctrine that is meant to apply to foreigners and aliens is used against fellow citizens deemed to be undesirable. Iowa Congressman Steve King, a self-described American nationalist, gave pitch-perfect expression to this view when he asked disingenuously, when did the language of white supremacy become offensive? The term white nationalist makes perfect sense. The term white patriot is an oxymoron. Nationalists like King and Mazzoni may adopt the posture of celebrating national traditions and particularities, but their views are invariably based on a logic of exclusion, of dividing the world into irreconcilable alternatives of us and them. Okay, so much for one extreme or one pathology to which patriotism is prone, the nationalist extreme. What about the other end of my Aristotelian continuum? Patriotism and cosmopolitanism. At the other end of this continuum, the deficiency of patriotism involves a kind of trans-political cosmopolitanism. The cosmopolitan idea runs deep in the Western tradition. It is very much present in Plato's Apology of Socrates, who was the first political philosopher
Go
who was accused
to
of treason,
Tocqueville
betrayal,
literacy.
not believing in the gods of the city,
You
and for
choose
corrupting the
watch
young.
live stream.
But ancient cosmopolitanism was given its canonical expression by the Stoics, who lived in the 1st and 2nd centuries of Common Era and who coined the phrase to become a citizen of the world. But present-day cosmopolitanism has been decisively shaped by a German philosopher, Immanuel Kant. Kant stressed that our moral duties and obligations respect no national boundaries or other parochial attachments, whether they be race, class, or ethnicity. The Kantian moral law, what he called a categorical imperative, is not a divine command emanating from the voice of God, but is a law that wells up from within ourselves, obedience on universality, that a moral law is one that can hold for all rational beings anywhere, however situated. Stress that we are all members of a kingdom of ends, one where every individual, however humble, odd, or eccentric, is due equal moral value and respect simply by virtue of their reason or humanity. Humanity as such is worthy of virtually limitless esteem and respect, or what Kant called dignity. It's an admirable idea. It is not immediately obvious that Kant's theory of moral duty would bear political fruit. He presents morality as something binding on individuals, but not necessarily on collective bodies like states. Yet Kant could not entirely separate his theory of morality and moral personality from politics. It is not sufficient for a government to provide peace, prosperity, and security, the whole, you might say, domain of public legal rights for its citizens. Kant had an unprecedented awareness that what goes on within the domestic politics of one state is crucially tied to the domestic affairs of its neighbors. It followed that an enlightened government had both the duty and the interest in maintaining a vigilant watch over the fate of human rights everywhere, not only for its own citizens, but in all quarters of the globe. Since rights at home were continually threatened by war or the potential for war abroad, the first order of government must be to secure the conditions for peaceful cooperation between states. In Kant, one finds, perhaps for the first time, a philosopher who grants priority to international over domestic politics. Kant's plans for an international League of States, League of Republics, came to fruition. A century and a half later, Woodrow Wilson's famous 14 points elaborated before World War I, and then later the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 at the inauguration of the UN. Kant is also the source of much of the democratic peace literature that was so much in the news a generation ago. But the question is, to what degree is the cosmopolitan ideal compatible with the patriotic sentiment? Too often, of course, the new cosmopolitanism is not cosmopolitan at all, but a culture-bound idea expressing the values of one part, and perhaps only a very small part of westernized humanity. It runs counter to virtually the universal experience of humankind that regards human identity as shaped by the families, religious affiliations, communities, and other groupings of which we are a part. The idea of the citizen of the world is often conceived as aloof and detached staring down on human affairs from above as if from a distant planet. It seems a peculiarly loveless disposition. The model of cosmopolitanism today is drawn from the contemporary European experience, where the EU is taken by many to represent a new kind of transnational citizenship. This development was brilliantly predicted over a century ago by Friedrich Nietzsche, who described the emergence of a new phenomenon, what he called the good European, as someone who is beyond nationality and even politics. Nietzsche's description of a kind of restless individualism, essentially adaptive to new and changing environments, and with no ties to place, has certainly come to pass in the contemporary European world with its common currency, open borders, and increasingly stateless existence. Such a vision is notably different from an older conservative model of Europe as a Europe des patries, characterized by political diversity rooted in particular national states with their distinct and healthily competing religious and cultural traditions. American patriotism, however, like America itself, is unique. Ours is not an ethnic patriotism born of fantasies of blood and soil. Ours is a patriotism of ideas. In the crucial respect, America is the first truly modern nation, a nation founded upon the principles of modern philosophy. Our founding document, the Declaration of Independence, is dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. These principles were and are said to hold true not for Americans alone, but for all human beings, always and everywhere. Far from suggesting a traditional form of customary morality, American politics seems to require commitment to higher, even universal moral principles. There seems to be a cosmopolitan dimension built into the very nature of the American polity. And yet, at the same time, American patriotism is not a matter of abstract principle alone. Anyone, anywhere, can ascribe to the principles of equality and rights, but patriotism is an effective disposition. It is inseparable from a common history. Any true and effective patriotism can only have its foundation in a people's collective memory, in what we think of ourselves, and in the stories we tell about who we are. Who lives, who dies, who tells your story? These are the final words of Lin-Manuel Miranda's extraordinary musical Hamilton. How we tell our story will provide the ground of a common national memory, and how we come not only to understand, but to feel our lives together. It is in recollection of a shared history, which is to say the locus of a collective destiny, of common misfortunes and triumphs, that forges the bonds of a nation and a people. Symbols and rituals are important, or are as important as concepts and principles. In fact, the two require one another. Ours is a patriotism that uniquely combines logos and ethos. Symbols like the flag or saying the Pledge of Allegiance may simply be ceremonial affirmations that over time become dull routine. But routines are essential, such as standing in the ark containing the Torah is opened, as crucial reminders of something of incomparable worth and dignity. Patriotism, as I understand it, is an affect or a sentiment, as well as a principle and an idea. It is what Tocqueville called a habit of the heart. This is a way of stating that patriotism requires an understanding and appreciation not only for ideas or abstract ideas, but for a particular history and a tradition. I may appreciate the French language, its food, its countryside, its culture, but I cannot love France the way a Frenchman does. I can never quite feel the way a French woman feels when she hears the Marseillaise. I am reminded, of course, of the scene from Casablanca, the great film, where Yvonne, who has been seen consorting with a German officer, joins in the singing of the Marseillaise, drowning out the Germans who are gathered around the piano singing Die Wacht am Rhein. Her tears show that she has rediscovered her identification with France. Okay? I have some other film discussions in the book, some other Casablanca references I'd like to go into, but nonetheless. No discussion of patriotism would be complete without at least some reference to Edmund Burke. Burke understood that patriotism is rooted in the love of the particular, to be attached to the division, to the love of the little platoon. He wrote in a famous passage from the Reflections on the Revolutions of France, is the first principle, the germ, as it were, of public affections. It is the first link in the series by which we proceed toward a love of country and to mankind. There's been considerable debate over just what Burke meant by the little platoon. It has sometimes been used as a cudgel by which to attack big government and regulation. But Burke uses the image to indicate the birthplace of our moral education. The image of the little platoon is a point of departure, not a destination. It is but the first step in an ascent by which we climb the ladder of humanity. To be sure, Burke is not altogether clear on what he means by this passage of ascent. Does it suggest, as he says, an embrace of humanity and humanitarian goals, perhaps not so different from his nemesis, Richard Price, against whom the Reflections was written? Or does it extend only as far, perhaps, as neighboring kingdoms like France that are suffering from derangement of their traditional orders? This is suggested by the one in the passage just cited. The danger comes from those who, once ascending to the top of the ladder, proceed to kick it away. Patriotism, as Burke understood, is a peculiar species of loyalty or love. But love of what? And love of whom? How can one feel love or gratitude to millions of people that one can never even know? The kind of love that patriotism joins is best described as loyalty, and we can only be loyal to something particular. This does not require me to treat my country superior to others. I can be loyal to friends and family without thinking they are better than other people's friends and family. In fact, in some respect, they may be worse, but this doesn't diminish them in my eyes. Loyalty is more akin to a sense of gratitude. We are grateful to particular people and groups for making us who we are. Our loyalties define our identities and give us character. We cannot have loyalty in general, lest we become like the social scientist who said he wanted to get married, but to no one in particular. This issue was at the core of the debate between Gershom Scholem and Hannah Arendt over the publication of Arendt's book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, in 1963. In covering the trial for the New Yorker magazine, Arendt had submitted the Israeli tribunal and even the testimony of eyewitnesses to withering criticism, calling the very legitimacy of the proceedings into question. Scholem could not but regard this degree of detachment as a betrayal expressed at a time when the wounds of the Holocaust, he always preferred to call it a catastrophe, were still fresh. Under the circumstances, he wondered, would it not have been proper to show a little more moral sympathy for people operating under the most difficult circumstances? It was here that Scholem accused Arendt of lacking ahavat Israel, or proper love for the Jewish people. With you, my dear Hannah, as with so many intellectuals coming from the German left, there is no trace of this, he wrote. In treating such a theme, isn't there place for that humble German expression, a tact of the heart? Arendt replied loftily that she could not love an abstraction like a people, but only individual persons. I have never in my life loved some nation or collective, she wrote, not the German, French, or American nation, or the working class, or whatever else might be in this range, price range of loyalties. The fact that I love only my friends and am quite the fact is that I can only love my friends and am quite incapable of any other sort of love. There is in Arendt's statement a residue of her Kantianism, with its belief that we should view ourselves and others under the absolute rule of impartiality. But why is it wrong to love oneself and those most closely related to us? No one believes that love for one's people is like a personal friendship, or love for a parent or a spouse. Love for one's people means displaying a kind of gratitude for who we are. This kind of love, to which I think Scholem is referring, and to which Arendt seemed peculiarly tone deaf, is conveyed by the simple Yiddish term, mishpucha. Mishpucha means family, but more than immediate family. It means members of extended relations, fellow clansmen, landsleit, fellow countrymen. Mishpucha may not even be personal acquaintances, but we know them when we see them, by dress, habits, voice, and inflection, by body language, and a whole host of tacitly conveyed information. Such people are not intimates, but they are not entirely strangers either. We are also inclined to extend to them a certain level of trust that we may be less inclined to extend to others. Indeed, our sense of what I mean by this term, by people with an identity and a history inseparable from this concept, is conveyed by a joke told by Leo Rosten in his invaluable The Joys of Yiddish. The joke is that the Chase Manhattan Bank used to use for its advertising slogan, "You have a friend at Chase Manhattan," to which the Bank of Israel offered its own version. But here you have mishpucha, friends. I'm bringing this to a conclusion. Take a few more minutes. The theme of loyalty is invariably connected with the problem of conflicting loyalties. Our loyalties are never simple and one-dimensional. As creatures with multiple identities, we are bound to have multiple allegiances, don't we? Unless we had only one friend, our loyalty to friends would invariably conflict. Our loyalties to friends may be at odds with our loyalty to family, and our loyalty to family may conflict with our loyalty to country. In such cases of conflict, how are we to decide? Does love of country trump all other loyalties, or do the obligations of friendship trump patriotism, as E.M. Forster argued? There are many examples to choose from. In the book, I survey a few, but I only want to use one for purposes of time. It's connected to what I just talked about a moment ago. The particular case I want to discuss comes from Philip Roth's short story called Defender of the Faith, originally published in the New Yorker magazine in 1959. Any of you know the story? No? Michael? In this work, set in the final months of World War II, I highly recommend it, by the way, set in the final months of World War II, a decorated combat veteran named Sergeant Nathan Marks has been redeployed from the European theater and assigned to a training base in rural Missouri. Shortly after his appointment, he's approached by a young trainee named Sheldon Grossbart, a fellow Jew from the Bronx, who asks for an intervention on behalf of the 3 Jewish soldiers in the company. There is apparently a weekly cleaning of the barracks scheduled for Friday nights, when Grossbart complains the 3 of them should be attending Sabbath services, but they don't want to be seen as slackers. Marx is clearly uncomfortable with the request for such an exemption, but he reluctantly intervenes on their behalf. When Marx attends the service himself, he sees that only one of the 3 recruits, Mickey Halpern, has any sense of the occasion. The others are laughing and talking during the rabbi's sermon and are clearly using it, in fact, as an excuse to get away. This episode simply opens the door for further requests, and this comes to a head when Grossbart persuades Marx to let the 3 of them attend a belated Passover service at the home of one of their relatives in St. Louis, only to discover later that the three had just gone to a Chinese restaurant. The climax of the story occurs when the troops are ready to receive their assignments. Against his better judgment, Marx has revealed to Grossbart that he is being deployed to the Pacific, but later finds out that Grossbart has used his influence with another superior to get himself assigned a non-combat position in New Jersey, claiming that he needs to be near his ailing father. Realizing that he has been manipulated, Marx intervenes and has Grossbart reassigned to a combat zone. When Grossbart discovers the change of orders, he angrily confronts Marx, calling him a son of a bitch and an anti-Semite. "You owe me an explanation," Grossbart demands. "Sheldon, you're the one who owes explanations," Marx replies. "You call this watching out for me, what you did?" "No," Marx replies, "for all of us." For all of us. Defender of the Faith was one of Roth's most controversial stories, judging from the numbers of attacks on him, many quite personal. But the story asks the question, who is the defender of the faith? And what exactly is the faith that is being defended? Should Marx have stood by a co-religionist, or did he do the right thing in refusing to give special preference to one of his own, and even making sure that he was assigned to combat? Marx says that what he did for all of us. But who is the us to whom Marx refers? To fellow Jews? To Americans? The faith for which Marx acts, I suggest, is faith in America, or in the belief that no one's religion entitled them to either special burdens or special exemptions. He is a kind of old-fashioned patriot, and his refusal to let Grossbart use his religion and his sentimental appeals to avoid combat, Marx affirms his faith in the value of equality. This is the force of Marx's all of us. In the end, I think, and I believe Roth thinks, Marx was the true defender of the faith. Roth's story, however, is an example of what lawyers call hard cases. And like all such cases, they're fortunately the exception and not the rule. In fact, there is an old legal maxim that hard cases make bad law. It is dangerous to generalize from extreme examples to try to make a rule that covers normal circumstances. Such examples may be useful for clarification or for teaching Ethics 101, but less so as a guide for ordinary life. We are rarely called upon to choose family over country or country over faith, although obviously such cases are not unheard of. The good news is then that such conflicts are relatively rare. They are not the stuff of our ordinary moral experience. The bad news is, of course, there is no algorithm for determining the outcome when such cases arise, as they inevitably will from time to time. Should the conscientious objector honor his faith that says not to kill, or to honor his country that demands his service? This dilemma was faced by Abraham Lincoln, at the height of the Civil War, when he replied to a Miss Eliza Gurney, a Quaker from Philadelphia, who had met with him in the White House in September 1862, about the dilemma faced by the Friends who supported emancipation but were opposed to war. Lincoln seemed to be deeply touched by Gurney's visit, whose purpose was not to hector the president on what to do, but to pray with him for divine guidance. In a moving letter written almost 2 years after their meeting, Lincoln went on to express sympathy with the dilemma. "Your people, the Friends," he writes, "have had and are having a very great trial. On principle and faith opposed to both war and oppression, they can only practically oppose oppression by war. In this hard dilemma, some have chosen one horn and some the other." Lincoln here recognized the conflict of loyalties between the demands of faith and duty to country. Perhaps most revealingly, he refrained from interjecting himself in that dilemma. "For those appealing to me on conscientious grounds," he continued, "I have done and shall do the best I could and can in my own conscience, under my oath to the law." So even Lincoln, the supreme commander-in-chief, could not entirely find a way out of this perplexing dilemma. Thank you.
Thank you. What I'd like to do is to take a couple of questions at a time, and I'd like to give the students in the room the opportunity to ask the first questions if you have. So feel free to raise your hand. Otherwise, raise your hand, and I'll take a list of the questions here. So the floor is open. Okay, Simon.
I go first?
Yeah, go first.
Sorry, Bill.
No, you should go.
No, students first. I said, if there's anyone else, please raise your hand.
Do I look like a student?
Okay, Simon.
With yours.
Simon and then Bill.
So I think one of the good things about virtues, or talking about virtues, is that it guides us in difficult times, especially in crisis. So in turn, the fact that we talk more about some virtues sometimes indicate the absence of it, or at least the fact that it's kind of under siege. So it seems to me that it's kind of it's easier to talk about defending a certain kind of way of life when some kind of modus vivendi, at least like globally, can be achieved. But when we need this patriotism, this virtue the most, which means that this particular lifestyle that we're defending here is under siege. We need, this is kind of the moment to me that we need patriotism to guide us to act. Now, since patriotism is necessarily a collective emotion, it could become a mobilizing tool. And how exactly do we draw the line between the national zeal and a love of the country, or the love of a particular lifestyle in times of crisis? That's my question.
That's a great question. It's one I actually talk about a little bit briefly in the book. You might say patriotism in times of crisis is easy. Those are the times when it becomes easy, easiest. 9/11, or other times of even existential crisis to the country, when survival or so on seems to be at stake or under attack. But I don't want to talk about patriotism as a virtue only in the moment of crisis. In fact, I think that's why I made a point of saying patriotism should be seen as what I call the lowercase virtue. It doesn't need a big capital letter to identify it in the times. And I think and loyalty, as I understand it, is one of these lowercase virtues, which possibly is why I say it never quite received the attention I think it deserves. It's a day-to-day. Patriotism is a day-to-day kind of virtue. Being loyal, showing respect, kind of civic, you might say civic friendship, in the way that I talked about using that term mishpucha, in the debate between Scholem and Arendt. It's that kind of quality, and one of the things that I want to do in the book and tried to suggest in the paper is that we distinguish it from this kind of there's this kind of hyperventilating patriotism and nationalism, which is easy to come by, again, and it's not always it can be misdirected, but it can be well directed too. But mine is a virtue of patriotism for you might say also normal times. There's a very interesting, just if any of you, I'm sure some of you are studying the history of political thought, there's a very interesting discussion, short but useful discussion of patriotism in Hegel's philosophy of right. I'd like to show off my memory by remembering the paragraph number, but I don't at the moment, but it's easy enough to locate. Where he makes a point of making the distinction I just made. It's not altogether clear, but he does make a distinction between patriotism used for moments of extraordinary political times of war and national crisis, from what he wants to defend as kind of patriotism in daily life, in the quotidian, in the lowercase. And that's what I think is important to keep in mind.
Thank you. Bill.
That was a great talk. Thanks a lot. So it seems to me that the difficult question would be with patriotism. So relationship between abstract principle and abstract consent. How exactly should we see that relationship, right? How do they interact with each other and so on? You just mentioned Hegel. I think Hegel would have to come down on the side of abstract principle. Certainly the American founders would have to say that. So Crucial, you were talking about that. And so, and you seem not to be doing that. You seem to be saying it's sentiment, affect, love, reverence, familial ties. So I guess I have two concerns. One is, how in fact can you do justice to patriotism, let's say within a liberal polity? You try to do that, but I thought ultimately you end up downplaying abstract principles as part of our political identity, right? I mean, I just want to hear more about that. And then the other issue, I guess this is the more important one, is I don't see conceptually how you're going to clearly distinguish nationalism. It's not just, I just don't see how it's just an excess of patriotism on your terms. I mean, because nationalists appeal to all of these things that you see as essential to patriotism. That's essential to these sort of excessive nationalisms that you're worried about. So I just don't, I'm having a hard time. I mean, it's an excess, but it's an excess in the sense that it seems to be built into this notion of patriotism. It's a necessary excess, and that might.
Let me start with the second one, the second part of that first, because I think you're right in the way you described it, and that's the way I described it. I said I sort of disagreed with both Gilles Lepore and Emmanuel Macron to say these are opposites. I can understand the rhetorical purpose of making that point, but they're not. One is correctly said is an excess of the other, in exactly the Aristotelian term that every virtue has an excess and a deficiency, and I think it is an excessive form of patriotism, and one of the chapters deals with a kind of genealogy of nationalism, how in patriotism how they in many ways grow out of a common root, the love of something particular. If you want to, I'll just give you I use partly cribbed from Isaiah Berlin and others. I use Herder as kind of the original form of nationalism, which is benign in a certain way. It's a recognition of cultural plurality. There are many ways of being human, and there's a kind of openness and liberalism and pluralism in that view. But over time, and very quickly, the identification of plurality of nations comes hand in hand with the demand that each nation be represented by a state. Fichte, the addresses to the German nation, make that case very powerfully. That it's not just enough to have a plurality of cultures. Each culture must be represented by a political form, by a state, and it's only a step from there, as I argue, to Carl Schmitt's view that each state is locked into a position of existential struggle with every other state. That each state, it's about ins and outs, and this becomes a kind of almost a metaphysical principle of opposition and conflict. What Hegel called the labor of the negative, the politicization of that. And that is an excess of patriotism, and one that I want to say grows out of it, but distorts it in some important and recognizable way, and from which I want to defend what patriotism, correctly understood is about. Principle and affect is another theme that runs throughout the book, and I only touched upon briefly here. You're right, again, to see the founders often represented the principles as central. They were setting things up. They recognized the principle. So you could even say, although I don't put it quite this way in the book, that my view is something of a correction or critique of the fund, because it understands that principles can only be sustained through certain effective dispositions and habits. And I'm trying to rehabilitate not only the Aristotelian idea of an ethos, but these kind of 18th century ideas of moral habit and disposition. Tocqueville too clearly thinks about the mores as part of what sustains a culture, in which I think perhaps the founding principle, founders focusing on institutions and principles, we're not altogether cognizant of or not altogether concerned with. But I think that we have to see these two as working together to sustain one another, while recognizing, of course, there may be a tension between those. But it's easy, again, it's easy for people to, it's easier, I think, for intellectuals to endorse the principles, because we like the principles, we like equality, and there's the kind of universality about it. We're less comfortable, although I think kind of more everyday Americans don't have this discomfort, with affirming the affective emotions and dispositions. Those seem to be kind of, if not exactly irrational, they don't quite fit philosophic definition in the same way.
Yeah, but isn't the question, so I'm with you, I think, except I would say the affect is derivative of the principles, right? So, we should be patriots in the sense of our constitutional order and a particular political culture attached to it, which of course includes all sorts of complicated things, many of which are emotional. It doesn't include, however, many of the things that Orwell lists, right? It doesn't include, something when I lived abroad, one thing I missed as an American was baseball games on a lazy Saturday afternoon, not watching the Yankees, watching the Mets. But that should not be part of that, So you'd have a different view, I think, of the effective aspect.
Right. You can't derive that from the principle.
Right.
It's hard for me to get into. It's hard for me to get into one of these chicken and egg questions about which is first. Do the principles in fact come first, and we create our traditions and customs to support them, or are we working? Are we always work? I don't know. I don't know that. To me, it's kind of an unsolvable question. I just prefer to see them somehow sustaining one another, or trying to sustain one another.
Okay, I'd like to take two questions just to allow more people to ask, and then the conversation. Feel free to answer them as you think fit. So I'm going to take Stefan Kolev and Mike McGuinness first. Okay. I think I remember.
So thank you. This was extremely interesting. My question is about patriotism and migration. So we live in societies today which are not only the US, but of course also Europe, full of people like myself who have lived in very different countries. So my question is, so is patriotism something which we learn? Is it something which we can only learn at early age? Is it something which we can, when we move to another country, perhaps put as a sandwich on top of that early patriotism? How many would we have? So what is your...
how many passports you can put?
How many passports can you stack? And what kind of conflicts could you conceptualize?
Thank you. Mike?
Yeah, I don't know if this is related to that or not, but I'm trying to see how this fits into the logic of the way institutions shape society. Institutions are affected by broader principles, but also are embedded and so forth. So it seems to me that one type of loyalty an individual might have is that if you're taking on a social value, a social role of some kind that is defined by an institutional structure, so that if you're somehow loyal to the institutional structure as a whole, as distinct from the specifics of what's happening or as a principle. But when you're in that role, there's a certain way you should be looking at problems and certain ways you should be making decisions. Like the Philby example, in Philby, for example, if you're looking at it from the ethics such as there are within intelligence services, he was not pursuing the right role in that right social sort. So he was not loyal to the notion of being a British agent in some sense. That may not be more important identification than others, but part of what patriotism is taking those kinds of socially defined institutional roles seriously enough for them to be something you would be loyal to. Does that make any sense?
I have a kind of answer. I'm not quite sure whether, but let me start with the first one.
Okay.
I have to ask you, are you a Chicago fan?
No, just put it on.
Okay.
I saw you were. You came from
His loyalty
Thank
was...
you. The migration issue is something I talk about briefly in the book. I mean, and how, the question, as I understand, is how for a recent arrival, how is patriotism acquired? How do you develop this, or how is it developed? In many ways, I want to say, American patriotism is in some respects kind of easy to come by. It doesn't require anybody to have lived here for 17 generations, as it does in many countries. I mean, it can come fairly easily. You know, you express in a civil ceremony of some kind knowledge of and identity with certain, you know, understanding of principles of American government and equality and et cetera, and that's enough. That makes you a citizen. That's and again, as I say, you know, in a certain sense, fairly easy to come by in comparison to many places. And of course, we all know recent immigrants are often the most patriotic Americans. It's the ones who've been here forever, who take it much more for granted, and new arrivals are often more patriotic than native-born or others. But I do think the dispositions. I mean, the kinds of, again, habits, dispositions, and so on do take time to acquire. My grandmother always spoke with a slight accent, and she was embarrassed by this somehow. She thought it was embarrassing, but she couldn't escape it. It was to her always a mark of being different somehow, when being different was not such great thing. But I don't have quite an answer to it. I do think it's American patriotism or an American identity is both in some ways easy to come by, and yet at the same time it takes time, like anything, to acquire through practices and through habits and so on, to, you know, like any new place, learning your way around in a place. The question of institutional loyalty is also something I briefly take up in the book. There's an excellent essay by Judith Shklar which I talk about, called Loyalty, Obligation, and Exile. I guess is the third category. And she speaks about, in a way that made sense to me when I read it, at least. She speaks about institutional loyalty. Institutional obligations is somewhat different from loyalty. We have obligations to institutions. Institutions are usually big impersonal organizations like the Indiana University or a public bureaucracy or something like that. We have obligations to them. This is not quite the same thing as loyalty, which is an affect, which also has this affective component to it. I said at the beginning of the lecture, I'm very loyal to Yale, which is which has become certainly a big bureaucratic institution. In some ways, I'm not sure it's loyalty. In some respect, I don't think it's quite worthy of the same kind of loyalty because it's become too impersonal. But so I may be, at least on Shklar's view, kind of blurring her categories, because she just thinks loyalty is affective. It requires more of your personality in it than do obligations, institutional obligations, which can, in a way, like kind of Weberian rules, can be rationalized, and you can put them down in a code book and so on and so on. Loyalty is somewhat different. And I agree with that. I think loyalty, as I'm trying to spell it out, has a kind of effective status, going back to Bill's query about the role that I ascribe to this, which is different, although overlapping with institutional commitments. These are also different, by the way, from, I just use the term commitments, from personal commitments, like we have to friends or spouses. Marriage is a commitment of a certain kind. Loyal, patriotism isn't that kind of commitment. That's also what I think is at the core of partly what the Scholem-Arendt debate is about. Arendt says, well, how can I love a people or a country? I can't feel commitment like I can to my friends. But of course, Scholem's point, my point would be that's silly. Of course, we're not saying that that's what it is. And either she was just being kind of deliberately obtuse about that, or maybe she just couldn't feel it. I mean, that's possible also. Maybe she just didn't have that feeling. But that would be very strange to me for someone who spoke as well as she sometimes did about politics. And patriotism, a point I'll make now, maybe implicit in the paper, but not stated as such, patriotism is inseparable from politics, from the political, etymologically, and in many other ways. So the question to me is not whether we're going to have patriotism or whether we're not. The question is, what kind of patriots are we going to focus to also pretty much about?
Regarding your loyalty to Yale, there's a joke at Princeton: too male, too pale, too Yale. So
It would be hard to say that today, but okay.
Jason Wu and Jeff Isaac.
Great. So, a couple of questions. So one question is, should patriotism be a function of privilege on some level? So, should the extent to which you have a patriotic commitment depend on how your family, community, faith, country's treated you, how Yale has treated you? Is it a function of your ability to feel these affective attachments? Like what if your personality is such that you just, aren't inclined towards
Right.
love of any kind?
I get you.
Is it like just a reciprocal thing, where it's, because it seems like often when we talk about it, there's this limited universality to how we, think about patriotism. So I guess, to put a point on it, who should be an American or a Chinese patriot? Who's been treated such that they should feel that up?
Jeff?
Oh, okay. So I actually want to. So fantastic talk, Stephen.
Thank you.
And I think part of what's so excellent about the talk is the way you interweave political theory and literature and film, and actually I problematize a bunch of questions rather than make like a very strong argument. I want to press you on the Arendt Scholem story, and I want to bracket out the fact that Arendt had, in fact, a very complicated relationship with Zionism. That's been written about extensively, and I think would complicate your story. But even putting that aside for a second, so Scholem basically, as you wonderfully quote him, calls her to task for not having love of the Jewish people, and in fact says that this is a common characteristic of the German left. That's his critique of her. Now, interestingly, both Scholem and Arendt were German Jews who fled Hitler. Scholem emigrated to Palestine and became an Israeli citizen. Arendt fled first to France and then to the United States in 1940, where she became an American citizen. Now, what Scholem is doing in his critique is basically questioning an aspect of her moral character for her lack of love of the Jewish people, treating that as prescriptive. She's resisting this. But I think what's really interesting to think about is the question of how each of them has a different experience as a refugee, immigrant, and in fact citizen. Mm-hmm. So two aspects of Arendt's experience, which I think is affective as well as intellectual and principled, help to explain of the Eichmann trial, one of which is the experience of being a refugee, which is an affective experience and something that she theorized. And Sholem is basically saying, I'm home now in the land of Israel. Arendt, I think, very powerfully always thought of herself as being a refugee. That changes everything, including the way she thought about Palestinians in that territory as well as Jewish refugees. But the second question is American citizenship. She was an American citizen. She loved the United States. She was a patriot of the United States. And she loved, in fact, the traditions of the American Revolution. She wrote a book about it. Actually, at the same time that she was engaging in this controversy about Eichmann, she was basically writing on revolution. So there are conflicting loyalties here, but there are also conflicting affective identifications and also conflicting patriotisms. So I don't think it's fair to say she was lacking in a sense of patriotism. Her experience led her to a very different set of identifications and affective connections. I wonder, yeah.
Let me
Yeah, sure.
Let me start with the first question, which I love that question, which started with the observation or the question whether patriotism is a function of privilege. Yes. One of the things that often strikes me is, in this country at least, how people from the least privileged backgrounds are often the most patriotic, and sort of the reverse too, the ones from the most privileged backgrounds, the least. To use an example, to use a baseball example, and one that I used with a student group this morning, I'm struck, and I'm sure as everybody must be, when you go to a baseball game or a sports game, they play the national anthem. Thousands of ordinary citizens rise in respectful observation of this ritual, sing along or stand at quiet, a moment of quiet. Try doing that on a college campus and see what the response would be. It would be very, very different from, and I use the college as an example of privilege, and so a certain kind of education and privilege, and this disconnect between ordinary, the kind of immediate kind of gut replies of an ordinary American, and I would say a privileged American. So I do not think patriotism is a function of privilege, and in a kind of perverse way, we've gone in the reverse. Part of what the book is about, in the last parts of it, try to recommend, is that patriotism, I want to say, is not, contrary to maybe some of our beliefs, patriotism is not just something we naturally imbibe just by being here. It's something that has to be taught. You have to be educated. It has to be taught. And in fact, the danger of not teaching it is that it's easy to morph into some perversion of it, nationalism and other kinds. Patriotism is something that has to be taught in school and in other formats. And I think we as students, whether of history or political science or philosophy, ignore this at our peril. I mean, when was the last time you went to a job talk in a political science or history where someone talked about patriotism as a theme? And I think we ignore this, and I think it used to not be the case. The idea of college and a liberal education was to prepare people for a certain kind of patriotic service to their country. It wasn't thought of as propaganda or ideology. It was just part of liberal education to become. So I think education remains a central dimension of the way in which patriotism has to be taught. Finally, I'm inclined to go on about this, but for purposes of time, let me get to Jeff's question. And I'm so glad and not entirely surprised that you wanted to defend Arendt against my mischievous attack on her reputation, and that also has its sources and so on. Look, I'm sure, let me just say, it's kind of similar, I'm sure you're probably right about this. I'm sure you are right about this. And it's an interesting look at the way in which these two giants of German thought of, this period responded to issues of Germany, the Holocaust, Judaism, and other things. I think Scholem had a limited, but I still think valid point, was that when it came to Jewish nationalism or Jewish patriotism in this way, for purposes of this, I'm going to just use the terms maybe synonymously. Arendt seemed to have a real blind spot. I don't know enough about, I've read some of her earlier essays, which do seem to be friendlier to Zionism, if I remember. But she seemed to develop an antipathy to it that, to me, I don't know enough about her writing or to understand. A real antipathy. It comes over in anybody who reads the Eichmann in Jerusalem book. I think the treatment of the I'm sure there are many reasons that one can be critical, et cetera, of the court and how it was done, but you sense more than that. There was an antipathy, and I think Scholem sensed and understood this, and I guess it broke up their friendship over this. I'm not sure that what happened. I'm not exactly sure the aftermath of, if there was one, what happened, if they ever met again or something after this. But it did, I think, seem to kind of be a final straw for him. And on Arendt in America, I'm also going to defer to you on this. I actually thought her book on revolution was, historians hate the book, but I've always sort of liked it. I thought it was a good book. Why? Because it showed, it really did show an appreciation for the American Revolution as a revolutionary moment. And it also participates in this kind of debate between the French and the American Revolution. She comes out on the side of America, all to the good from my point of view. Her substantive views about what American patriotism were not always sensible. I'm thinking of the Little Rock.
Can I follow up just very briefly?
Go ahead, please, because I'm not quite sure where
Because
I'm going.
I'm really
with
not
this.
interested in defending her, and I certainly agree with you on Little Rock. I guess my point is only her reaction to Scholem. You clarified just now, you said on the question of Jewish nationalism, on the question of Zionism, she does not identify the way he does.
No.
But I think the dialogue really raises the question of what is prescriptive. I mean, she's refusing to be held to account only to that identification. And the question is not, does she have identification or affect of loyalty or even a sense of patriotism to something? It's, does the fact that she is of a Jewish family require her to identify with Israel the way he does? That's the question I think that the dialogue is raising. And it's not about whether she, I mean, there are lots of flaws in her, and I don't really care about her. But I think the dialogue,
I may care about her more, but I don't.
What's beautiful about your talk is the way you use stories to develop really complicated issues. And I just think there are other ways of telling that story that further complicate this. That's all.
I'm sure you're right. Let me say something unprecedented. You may be right.
The emphasis is on me. There are four people on the list I want to read. Michael Morgan, Salih Yassoon, Dean Luck, and our guest,
Howard Lodge.
Howard. So we'll take two and two, Michael and Salih.
I've appreciated, like Jeff, I appreciated the use of film and the concreteness of the account, which is really, I think, its strength. You know, it's kind of attempt to articulate the fullness of a thick moral and political concept in all its complexity, right? But there's a kind of, at the abstract level, I keep getting hung up about what, not patriotism, but patriotism, and you slid back and forth from patriotism to loyalty and whatever, but patriotism I'm very puzzled by it. I think it's already emerged in some of the discussion. I mean, is loyalty a form of identification? Is it a form of responsibility? Is it a form of indebtedness? Is it pre-reflective? That is, if someone is loyal and expresses their loyalty, once they start to think about it, they're no longer being loyal. They're doing something else. They're talking about or considering whether they have responsibilities of an articulate kind, obligations or duties or something like that, and that's no longer being loyal, so to speak, specifically, or it's a way of expressing the loyalty, but it's not, the loyalty is a kind of, pre-reflective attachment or something. So, and I'm very puzzled about this. I mean, the more I think about it, the more I realize that this is one of those notions that we don't, we don't have a really good articulate idea of what it is that we're talking about. We're talking about that rather than all the ways that it gets manifested and expressed.
Sally? Yes. So you tie the concept of loyalty to habits of the heart in Tocqueville's. Thank you. In Tocqueville's writing. So I'd like to also hear your opinion on the concept of tyranny of majority and loyalty. So I can envision concepts where a group of individuals are all loyal to an aggregate dimension, an aggregate dynamic, would disregard individual concepts, individual liberties, objections to some big events. And one concept that comes to my mind is the public mood leading to war in Iraq, where many individuals stood silent. Or I could give an example of average Turkish citizens who are silent on Kurdish incursion, or Israeli citizens, who are loyal to Israel, so they don't raise any objections on what's going on against Palestinians. So if we envision a society where there is a minority of nationalists and a majority of loyal citizens, it could easily lead that the minority could sway the opinion. So yes, that's my point.
Okay, great for both. Okay, Michael, your questions or your observations about loyalty are very useful, and fortunately, I still have a little time left with this manuscript that I can go back and maybe clarify some of these points, because I want to say, in a way, loyalty. You use terms like, does loyalty mean identification? Is it responsibility? Is it a kind of pre-reflective attachment? And I want to say sort of all of the above. I think those are all dimensions of what I'm calling loyalty, but it's also very possible I need a crisp, maybe that's the philosopher in you speaking, I need a crisper definition of what it is. Actually, one of my chapters ends with a discussion of Weber's famous ethic of responsibility, the way patriotism requires a kind of responsibility as well. So that's certainly part of the picture. But I think all of those features, identification, responsibility, and a kind of pre-reflectiveness, I guess habit of the heart, we speak of these things as habits, as dispositions, as sensibilities. These are all terms at some point, at various points I use them to describe it.
Well, it's odd to call it a virtue then.
Why?
Well, I mean, so often we think of virtues as requiring a kind of being informed and having a kind of cognitive dimension to them
Well,
that constitutes them being targeting, you know, a capacity that's targeted in a certain sort of way. I mean, I can see why one might still call, you know, a kind of, you know, a pre-reflective attitude of virtue.
Well,
But there's certainly a lot of classical
sure, but
reasons for
I
thinking.
also want to say, I mean, right, it's some, just because something grows out of habits and dispositions doesn't mean it can't be given, or I want to argue, it doesn't mean it's incompatible with reflection. I mean, my response to the question here about the importance of education and teaching these things means, of course, taking that something that may be at a certain level pre-reflective and giving it some kind of reflective and clarification, lest it, you know, morph into something very undesirable. So I don't think that, or at least I don't look at the way in which a virtue like patriotism may grow out of certain kind of habits and sentiments that we have that can't be seen as also compatible with giving it some. I mean, I think that's what Aristotle does throughout the Ethics. Takes our habits and tries to articulate a rational picture of what those become. Your question is very powerful and raises the question, as you rightly put, about the dangers. What about the dangers? You know, I'll put it a slightly different way. What about the dangers? What about the dissenter, or the person who you talked about the tyranny of the majority? Will that the dangers of patriotism becoming a kind of collectivist tyranny over people who don't agree or who dissent from that view. I mean, that's always a danger. That's always a danger. I think it's something to which I would say thoughtful patriotism needs always to be attentive to. And one way of making us attentive to it or keeping us attentive to it is being aware of the conflict of loyalties that we all experience. My patriotism on certain issues doesn't prevent me, or it shouldn't prevent me from entering into, in some degree appreciating what people who don't exactly share my sentiments, you know, where they might be coming from and how they may understand the situations in a very different way. So I certainly don't want to use, I understand the Senate where it's coming from. I don't want to use patriotism as a cudgel in which to, you know, banish, like I said, it's not a language, to me it's not a language of exclusion and who is in and who is out in the Hazoni form of this, the Yoram Hazoni form of it. But I'll just leave it there. I realize this is a problem. This is a danger. But we can never have flawless solutions to these.
2 minutes and 3 questions.
Oh,
I'd like
okay.
to be very quick. Dean, Howard, and then Mark.
I'm going to give myself
very quick.
Yeah, I'm going to give myself away as an economist here. So, how would you measure patriotism and have other people measure it? Because in fact, you implicitly make some empirical claims about certain groups in answering some of the questions here.
Thank you, Howard.
To some extent, this may have been touched on, but I don't think it was fully. Basically, what do you do if you disagree with the group that you're loyal or patriotic to? That is something if we can grapple with that question, I think we can define something.
Yeah.
Basically, I'm sorry.
Mark?
Can we make a distinction between unconditional loyalty and conditional loyalty in terms of a person's like a certain type of loyalty where you're just attached to somebody no matter what they do and you're going to be loyal to them versus, well, I'm loyal because you're a good person, but if you cease to be a good person, I might not be loyal to you. And then map that on to your nationalism and patriotism distinction, whereas nationalism seems to be, well, you're part of the group and you need to go along, otherwise you're going to be cast out, versus, okay, patriotism is connected to adhering to a set of principles. So like Burke said, for a country to be loved, it ought to be loved.
Thank you. You have 1 minute to answer 3 questions.
I'm going to start with the middle one first, which I thought was very intriguing. What do you do with people you don't agree with? One answer would be don't give up on loyalty. Don't give up on patriotism. And I've kind of steered away from contemporary politics, but I'm going to put it into the pot at the moment. It seems to me one of the things the Democrats have failed to do, or one thing they've allowed to happen, is to allow patriotism become entirely a language of the right.
Right.
And I think you don't give up on patriotism. You have to reclaim it. The book was originally called, and Aurelian knows the story, it was originally called Reclaiming Patriotism, because I do want to reclaim it, and I think that's what we have to do. Measuring patriotism, I have less, Jonathan Haidt, the guy, he's not written about patriotism as such, but he has written about loyalty a bit, and I've used it in I referenced at least his book, The Righteous Mind. He's a psychologist, I'm sure you know, but I'm sure there's a way of doing this, but you're talking to the wrong person. It's the measurements, I don't have that, and yeah, conditional and unconditional loyalty. I mean, I started by saying loyalty, patriotism is a relative virtue. I mean, it's relative. It's not absolute. Patriotism is not used in the Aristotelian distinction between the good human being and the good citizen. Loyalty, you have to remember, loyalty to country is not the highest good, if we accept this distinction. And this is often the danger with it. We lose a sense. Patriotism is a kind of conditional good. And that's what I think the Lincoln story at the end about the Quakers, people of faith, they helps us see this, and should probably be used to keep patriotism within the bounds of, to use a term that Aurelian likes, within the bounds of moderation.
That's an excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you. I need one signature here.
Oh, thank you. I've been thinking about it myself.
Someone wants to talk to you. You want to talk to yours?
Well, you have to